It gives me very great pleasure to welcome everyone to Essex County College's annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Program. Dr. Akil Khalfani, the director of our Africana Institute, is our keynote speaker today. His topic is 50 Years Later, in recognition of that fateful day in 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated. Dr. King has left a legacy literally worldwide. It is also clearly evident right here at Essex County College. We have the Martin Luther King Jr. Library on campus. Our campus is also bisected by Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Both serve as daily reminders for all of us of the important legacy that was Dr. Martin Luther King as his memory lives on. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is quoted as saying, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." Here at Essex County College, we accept that challenge and stand on the principle that all are welcomed, all are respected, and all deserve a quality education. Dr. King also stated, "We may all have come on different ships, but we're in the same boat now." Aside from the rhetoric of today, we stand united here at Essex County College. Together, let's embrace one another as we exceed expectations. Again, welcome, and let's celebrate together in unity the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Good morning. Before I play these selections for you, I want to just share with you some information that might help you, or at least, let me say this, will share with you how I came to understand the music. This first selection is called Troubled Waters. It's actually based upon this spiritual. The first time I heard this selection, a pianist played it, and it was a composition that I immediately loved, and I had to play it. I had to add it to my repertoire and perform it for people. And I learned it, and then, you see, the spiritual Wade in the Water is customarily sung during the service of baptism. And I knew that because I've been playing for church since I was 7 or 8 years old. But I was curious as to why Margaret Bonds didn't call it Wade in the Water, transcription or arrangement or paraphrase, why she called it Troubled Waters. And I know there's the Bible verse where it says God's going to trouble the water, but the song itself is a spiritual. These were songs that were sung by my people during that period of enslavement. And this was how they communicated to one another through the songs. And they were actually coded so that, you know, the lyric, wade in the water, children. And when I say coded, what I'm referring to is the fact that it had two meanings. There was the meaning that was on the surface, let's put it that way. And Massa in the plantation heard this, and he said, okay, they're singing when they're spirituals, they're going to get baptized. But the other meaning was this, and this helped me understand why I feel Margaret Bonds called it Troubled Waters. The other meaning was this: if you were a slave and you were seeking freedom and you escaped the plantation, at some point You needed to get into the water. Why? Because the dogs were trying to track you down. And if you got into the water, they would lose your scent. I took it a step further, and this is Professor Alston's meaning, and what helps me play the piece and understand it. I took it further from the standpoint that when the slave got into that water, it might have been calm and peaceful, but once they got into the water, all the pain, all the agony that they had suffered being a slave got into the water with them. And now that water was no longer calm, it was troubled. My final selection was also based upon a song, actually a gospel song, by the great gospel songwriter Andre Crouch. And the words are just simply, "How can I give thanks for all the things that you have done for me? To God be the glory."
That was great. Thank you. I think he deserves another round of applause, Mr. Richard Alston. He's our own. Thank you. And next we have our keynote speaker, our very own Dr. Akil Khalfani. Dr. Khalfani is the director of the Africana Institute and the associate director of sociology here at ECC. He is a change agent, motivational speaker, and author.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Just give me 2 seconds to get my computer up and running. First of all, I want to take this time to thank our president for joining us and for giving us a welcome. Let's give Dr. Monroe another round of applause. I want to also thank Professor Richard Alston, who every year has partnered with us to bring this program into fruition and to both sometimes to have the choir to perform or students to give solos. And here today, obviously, his beautiful solo. So let's give him another round of applause. All these programs we do in partnership with Student Life and Activities, and Dean Slade is over here. I want to give her a round of applause. And Jamil Graham, let's give him a round of applause. Both of them, they do plenty of work to students to make things happen here. And so I'm excited to always be in partnership with them. Now, if we go over like 2 or 3 hours, forgive me, I am a professor. I do have a tendency to talk long. But I'll try to keep my remarks to a timely fashion. So today I want to also give a special thanks to someone who challenged me or challenged me in terms of the topic that I came up with. I was talking with Dr. Lee the other day, and he said, yes, 50 years later, what do you think about that? And I said, yeah, that's a good question. And so I took on the challenge of thinking about that. And so I appreciate his insights and his thought to bring that to fruition. So I hope that I've done justice to the question that he has posed and the situation that has presented itself here for us today. So we're going to start a little bit differently today. I want to start off by letting us assume that it is 2068, and we are looking back 50 years in time. We are told that by that time, the minority will be the majority in the United States, and that we want to explore and think about what will our descendants say about us. That is, that the folks who are alive in 2068, what will they think about us, right? So we can be a projection in terms of our thought, and we can be a looking back. And I think that we need to oftentimes look at ourselves, but look at ourselves from a different perspective. I challenge my students, those who are here, they should all be here, and make sure you sign in my office before you leave. But we want to challenge us to look at what we bring to the table and the perspectives for which we bring those things to the table. How is it that we come to understand what is our task? So what will our descendants say about us? About what we have done in the world and to the world? About what we have done to each other and for each other? How do we confront the challenges as individuals, as families, as communities, as nations of the world? For instance, will gentrification, urban and police violence still plague us? What does technology, communication, and entertainment look like in 2068? How has education evolved? Are students still buying expensive books and using computers to do their work? Or will there be some completely different thing that we haven't even thought about today? I mean, if you think back, did the people in 1968 have computers? Computers are an everyday thing today. So what might that future look like? Are schools going to still be highly segregated, as are churches and synagogues? We know that one of the most segregated places is Sunday morning. Is that still going to be the case in 2068? Will we still be talking about racial profiling as a social problem? So this morning, I want us to think about 3 things. First, what legacy do we want to leave behind? That is, what are people going to be saying about our contributions 50 years from today? What do we see? The second one is, what do we see as the impact of the legacy of our ancestors 50 years ago? That is, how are we doing with the mission and the assignments that they left behind for us? And then third, what are the hopes and visions of our predecessors 50 or more years ago? That is, what did they expect from us today? And have we accomplished what they expected for us to accomplish? So I'm going to look at these in reverse order. I'm going to start off in 1968. If we go back 50 years, what did they say and think about their future? To talk about 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, right? we must consider his understanding of the African world and the world around him. King often contextualized his understanding of the plight of his people in a global context. And I think we miss that. We oftentimes are so focused on what's going on in the United States that we miss that King, Malcolm X, and so many others had a global understanding of the troubles of the world. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, these were globalists. And we think that global reality is something new. But what they tried to get us to understand that the world has always been global. And we've taken out of context that global world in which we live. Because we listen to folks tell us that we are moving into a global economy and a global reality. But if we go back hundreds of years, if we go back thousands of years, the world has always been global. It's just that it's faster today. It's more convenient to do. And so our perspective on it needs to think about those ways in which the world became global today differently than it was before, but not that it's global today and it wasn't before. We have to see the world in that historical context. In 1963, in a speech entitled Our Summer of Discontent, or it was also referred to sometimes as the Negro Revolution, why 1963, King describes how African people saw the struggles for others Africans around the world. That is, that King talked about what was going on in the United States, is that people here, people of African descent here, that we saw that people in Africa and in the islands were struggling for their freedom. We know that in 1957, Ghana got its independence and set the foundation for independence movements all throughout Africa. And then when we look at that, we see that kind of movement created an environment of transformation, created an idea of resistance, created an idea of sustained movement and suggestion that what was going on at that time was not something that was going to be continued to be going on because people were going to push back, and that people were going to push back in successful ways. Central to the consciousness of raising people in the 60s was this idea that this evolvement of the movement was something that was bigger than their local surroundings. There was a chorus of events and leaders that brought the movement, the momentum that was needed to bring about change. You see, it wasn't just about having change or the idea of change. It took the momentum of that. It took leadership. It took courage. And, we have some of those individuals here today that are still around with us that had that courage. Those of you who don't know, a brother who works here in the city of Newark, who goes by the name of Larry Ham, right? Larry Ham is someone who has been an ongoing advocate for change since the 60s. He was the first and the youngest school board representative elected or appointed and then elected in the United States. And so right here in New Jersey, if you don't know him, they have rallies every week. Go out and learn something about what they do. If you want to learn about struggle, see, that's the thing. We have to learn about struggle. We think that we just jump up and do it. No, there's people who've been doing it for many, many years, and he'll tell you that he's doing it on the back of those folks who came before him. He learned what he learned from another great right here in the city of Newark, Amiri Baraka. Someone who had the tenacity, the courage to resist when others would not resist, to think outside the box when others thought that the confined box was the best place to be, who did things in ways that helped us to move the agenda down the road, because that's what we need to do. We need people who help us to move the agenda down the road, and these are some of the folks right here in your midst. And obviously, Amiri Baraka is no longer with us, but his son is the mayor of the city. His mother is still right here, and I'm sure she would have an earful for you if you really wanted to know how to take that struggle to the next level. See, we've got to get up off of our laurels and do things the way that they did them. They found folks who would give them insight, and they would go seek out their advisement. They would go seek out their instruction, and that's what we have to do today. We have to teach our young folks that it's okay to sit at the feet of the elders, because the elders have some wisdom that we know not. The elders have seen things, even if they don't have the education you have, they've experienced things that is a world of education in and of itself. And if you value that, then you think differently and you do differently. You see, I know that even though I have recently passed the 50 mark, that I still have elders whose feet I must sit at because I am still an elder in training. And that knowing that I'm an elder in training lets me know that there's things that I must learn that I don't know. What is it that you don't know that you need to know that's really at your fingertips, but you're resistant to going out and getting it? That you're resistant to going out and getting it. Because someone is there, like Minister Muhammad, is there for you to gain that insight from, who's been in the struggle, who studied in ways that maybe you have not, who maybe read a book or two more than the book or two that you read. Think about it. These actions these momentum that we were engaged in, these actions were political, spiritual, cultural, economic, social, psychological, and educational. This was the underbelly of the struggle, although it was not always characterized that way. You know, when we think back about it, that we had the challenges in our community of the cultural nationalists versus the political nationalists. And when you think about that struggle, Amir Baraka already says that was a false dichotomy. In other words, that was a situation that existed that didn't really exist. It was part of the divide and conquer, and we allowed folks to divide and conquer us instead of recognizing that we needed both the political and the cultural. We needed the spiritual as well as the educational. It wasn't an either or, never has been. And if we really want to be transformative about what we do, we have to recognize that it's a holistic struggle in the process of getting where we're headed and making sure that we achieve those things. In another speech, King said, "We ain't going to let no one turn us around," calling upon the Negro spiritual of resistance. This was the basis of his later speeches. I have a dream, and I've been to the mountaintop. So when we think about it, King's vision for us was the global village. He didn't have a dream deferred, quote unquote, dream deferred, if you know that reference. His was one that was actualized. So unlike Hughes's dream, it didn't explode. King visualized it from the mountaintop. As a young man who had not yet reached the age of 40, he knew, like Malcolm X, that the violent and racist conditions of his time would probably prevent him from reaching the point of seeing the changes that he worked so hard for. You see, when you're committed and you know that there's resistance and opposition, you don't have to be of the idea that you are going to be the achiever and the experiencer of all the things that you strive for. You have to realize that your strivings are for someone else. Your strivings are to transform the world in which you live so that others can experience it in ways that you didn't get to. And see, I recognize that, and that's one of the bases of why I do what I do and how I do what I do. You see, one of my personal heroes is a woman who was tenacious in her endeavors, who had resilience that we can't even comprehend, and she went by the name of Harriet Tubman. Yes. You see, Harriet Tubman, I mean, if you think about it, right? Harriet Tubman got free from being enslaved, and for many, that would have been enough. But she went back and freed her family. And for many, that would have been enough. But after that point, she went back and freed hundreds of people. And even said that I could have freed many, many more if they only knew that they were enslaved. You see, today, many of us might be enslaved still. Naim Akbar wrote a book called Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Maybe there's some chains on us, and we have a slave idea or mentality that's preventing us from achieving the things that we can achieve, that's preventing us from experiencing and realizing the dream that Martin Luther King had for us, that's preventing us from achieving the things that Malcolm X had worked so hard and realized that he was going to die in striving for those things. In Paul Robeson striving and losing all of his working ability because he was striving for something that other folks didn't like what he was striving for. That Muhammad Ali was striving for things that people didn't like what he was striving for, but he refused to do what they wanted him to do and stood by his principles. And so when we think about those things, maybe that's something that we need to think about today. What principles are you willing to stand up for? You see, the folks who had the placards back in the 60s that said, "I am a man," was no different than the placards today that says Black Lives Matter. What they both talk about are one's humanity. They're saying that I want my humanity recognized. And so if your humanity is not recognized, then we're going to stand up for it. That we're going to make a protest about it. And some people don't understand it. So they came up with the ideas of White Lives Matter. They came up with the ideas of Blue Lives Matter. Right? And so when you think about those things, we ask the question, why did they come up with those things in contradistinction to what folks who did Black Lives Matter was talking about? They didn't understand what Black Lives Matter was about. Black Lives Matter was saying that you are denying my humanity by the ways in which you treat me and my people. White Lives Matter says, I don't like you saying Black Lives Matter, so I'm going to come up with a countervailing argument. Right? So when you think about it that way, what you really have is that if folks were saying, see, what they try to argue is that all lives matter. But if they said all lives matter and they understood the struggles of Black Lives Matter, then they would say, okay, well, Black Lives Matter too. But you don't hear that argument. Right? The argument is one of countervailing dialogue as opposed to recognizing the humanity of African people. And that's what it's about. That we have to say that we want our humanity recognized. We want our humanity appreciated. I am a man didn't mean just it was a man. It meant that I'm a man, I'm a woman, I am a human being. Recognize my humanity and treat me thusly. Black Lives Matter says the same thing. Recognize my blackness, my being, my Africanity, and treat me in a humane way. You see, African people have a long history of understanding that. And they understand it through simple principles. There's a principle that says that you can't have 10 until your neighbor has 9. That's recognizing your neighbor's humanity, right? There's a principle that says moto ke moto kabato, which says there's a Sutu proverb, and it says that my humanity is recognized and stated and restored by my recognizing your humanity. So that for me to recognize and to be human is to state your humanity and to recognize your humanity. See, those are some principles that we need to go back to. Those are principles that are universal principles. Although they are African in their origin, other folks who want to counter the African origins of believing that all people should be treated, as Dr. King said, that African humanity needs to be respected. Latino humanity needs to be respected. Native American humanity needs to be respected. Right? But we have challenges with that today because everybody's humanity is not appreciated or respected. Now, when we look 50 years back, we could go another 50 years back, right? If we went another 50 years back in the future, in the past, we could ask the question, so in the end, I want us to consider this. How many multi-decade retrospectives must we compile before we have a lasting change for the benefit of all, right? That is that I'm getting ready to take you back a little further, and you'll see that this is an ongoing thing. And I want you to understand that 50 years before what I was talking about before 1968 was 1918. And so let's look at it this way. In 1790, for instance, New Jersey granted the right to vote for all free inhabitants, including women, in 1790. However, in 1807, women lost that right to vote in New Jersey. And after more than 100 years, that right was gained by all women in the United States, but not until 1920, with the passing of the 19th Amendment. So 1920 is a place for us to look at as a benchmark for 50 years later. It was 48, but close enough. So in 1918, women in the United States didn't have the right to vote. It took another 2 years, but after they had the right to vote once before. Why? Let's go back another 50 years. 1868. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1963, 5 years before. But the 13th Amendment didn't pass until 1965. This was 3 years after the end of the formal legal end of slavery, right? And in 1965 also, that's why we have the Juneteenth celebration, because Africans who lived in, where? Texas, come on now. Lived in Texas, didn't know and didn't have the exercise of their freedom for 2.5 years because there wasn't a military force strong enough to enable them to have that right. You see, we need to think about these things. We could go back another 50. No, let's go back another 100 years. 1768. The U.S. was a collection of European colonies. The Declaration of Independence was not signed until 1776. The Revolution was still to be fought, but genocide of Native Americans and Africans was afoot. The slave economy of the United States was the financial backbone of our society. How many 50 years do we have to go back and forward? We see the same ebb and flow of rights regarding the enslavement of people of African descent in the United States. We were freed or promised freedom by the British and the Spanish, only to be turned around and re-enslaved by another. During the Revolutionary War, the British promised freed Africans who helped their cause against the colonists, promised them freedom. If you fight on the side of the British, of course, the colonists did the same. However, after their defeat, that is the defeat of the British, many of the once freed Africans who fought valiantly were sent back to their former colonies as casualties of war and oftentimes re-enslaved. How far we got to go back and forth? This process of re-enslavement continued for over 240 years. W. Du Bois talked about it in his erudite statement called the problem of the color line, where he explored what is happening with the folks who were freed, right? The problem of the color line in the 21st century, when he had that he wrote that in 1900. And when he wrote that, what he was saying to us was that in the United States, the problem of the color line is that Europeans now are puzzled about what to do with all these Africans who are now free. Right? You have millions of people who were bound, tortured. See, we talk about it in the niceties, but it wasn't nice. There was no niceties about it. That they were tortured and bound and all these different things, atrocities that people of African descent experienced, that those atrocities that they experienced, that we experienced, that Du Bois is saying that this became a problem because now there was a new challenge for the society to figure out what to do and how to do it. And so we have to think about what that challenge was, how they came to understand what to do with that challenge. Du Bois also talked about it in Souls of Black Folks. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. It's a powerful book. Dr. King spoke about it in his speech that I already talked about, the Negro Revolution, why 1963. Douglas Blackman talked a bit about it in a book called Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of Black America from the Civil War to World War II. You see, what happened is that when we think about the freedoms of America and the freedoms of people of African descent within that context, is that there's the slavery that happened changed names, right? So that at the end of formal slavery, then you had what? You had a whole system of sharecropping. Then you had a system of convict leasing. And then you had Jim Crow, right? And now you have, and we move on to Michelle Alexander. And she explores the contemporary plight of African people in America in a book called The New Jim Crow. And she talks about how in the realities of the world that we live in, that the numbers of African and Latinos, primarily African people of African descent, who are imprisoned in the United States has increased dramatically. And it's increased so dramatically that it's almost unconscionable. And that it is almost incomprehensible. But it's only comprehensible, and she lays it out very clearly, because it's not that crime has increased, it's that there's been a process of changing criminality. That is, they've changed the ways in which people of African descent have been seen as criminals. And so that it wasn't that there was more drug users, it's that the laws about drug use changed. Right? It wasn't that there was more theft, it's that there was harsher sentences regarding theft. And so when we look at these things, we see that African people, African bodies have been criminalized as opposed to crime increasing. And you don't have to believe me. Go read her book. Right? Go do the research, and you'll begin to see that there's something afoot that we need to investigate. There's something afoot that we've got to look into and come to understand in different ways. We can't just accept things the way they were presented to us. These works encourage us to look at the struggles of Africans in America from a different lens. The struggles, the suggestion is that we need to understand the striving for liberty, equality, and justice under the conundrum of white supremacy and the tripartite systems of oppression based on race, class, and gender from a different perspective. There's some scholars who give us great insight to that. Back in the 40s, actually, Oliver Cromwell Cox wrote a book called Race, Class, and Caste. A very erudite analysis of it. Patricia Hill Collins wrote a book called, she's written several, but she wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought. And that book is a powerful book. She tells us that we need to begin to start looking. We can't find the answers to the problems that we see by only looking at race. We can't find the answers to the problems that we see by only looking at class. We can't find the answers to the problems that we see by only looking at gender. We must look at the three of them simultaneously, race, class, and gender, if we ever hope to fully challenge and resolve some of the problems that are in front of us. I add to what she's argued that we also need to look at liberty, equality, and justice simultaneously. See, when we look at any of those things individually, what happens is that it pops its ugly head back up in the other. So if you address race and you think you've resolved all the things regarding race, well, in class, race will pop its ugly head back up. In gender, race will pop its ugly head back up, right? And we see that today. What do we see with all the cases of women who are coming up and telling the stories of their abuse and of their abusers? But what we have seen only a touch of is that race is starting to pop its head up to that the experience of those women is different depending on race. And those stories are being played up differently based on race. And that, here again, those stories are playing up differently when we look at class. There was a story the other day that came up that talked about that even more so than the women in entertainment, that women who are working in the food industry is even worse, right? Waitresses and all the folks who work in the business, that their experiences are more extreme. And we would think we'd understand that because, in part, we know that there's going to be more women, right? There's more places, more opportunities for employment in that level of work than there are in entertainment industry. So there's a lot more women who would be possible to be in those positions than in the other. Other scholars, like Tukufu Zuberi, who was one of my mentors, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, they've written some great books. Zuberi wrote a book called Thicker Than Blood, goes and outlines the whole history of race and the history of statistical analysis of race. Bonilla Silva wrote a book called Racism Without Racist. And he goes to explore how race happens and what that means and how you have folks that say they're not racist, but racism happens. So if everybody says they're not racist, but we have racism happening, well, who's doing the racism? They all provide powerful tools for us to use in our efforts to dismantle these systems. And I say systems. Systems are important for us to understand. And Dr. Leonard Jeffries, often reminds us about systems analyses. And if we don't look at things as systems, that we oftentimes miss what the problems actually are because we're only looking at the surface and we miss that there's a system in place that is the thing that actually holds something in place. It's the system, not the individual. So that there are a lot of people who are of European descent who are not, it's not that they're bad people, but they participate in the system knowingly and unbeknowingly. And so therefore, racism plays itself out. White supremacy plays itself out because of the systems that are in place. See, slavery wasn't a slave owner. Slavery was a system of enslavement that was legalized by the statutes of the United States, by the statutes of the colonies, by the statutes of the states within the United States, right? That's how we have to look at it. What are those systems that are in place? And how do we attack and approach and understand those systems? How do we undermine those systems so that they don't continue to infect and affect us? That is, we need to take a step back from our familiar observations of the communities and the world so that we have the ability to observe and analyze global systems in place that manipulate and control the many for the benefit of the few. So I ask you, 50 years from today, what is going to be said about the legacy that you left locally, nationally, and around the globe? And if your mission is local, that's great. But to what extent is that mission informed by what's going on around the world? That is, that we must continue. There's an old maxim that says, think globally and act locally. Think globally and act locally. You have to see that you're participating in a world, not just your small community. Right? Their community is a part of the world, and they work together, but the things that you do locally have the benefit, the possibility of affecting and infecting the world in ways that changes it. When we think about the legacy, we can think about the footprints that we leave behind. And I ask you, what footprints will you leave behind? You see, there's two animals I want you to think about. There's a peacock. You know a peacock? The beautiful plume, right? But when the peacock walks, it drags its tail. And you can't see the footprints of the peacock. So I ask you not to walk like a peacock. I want you to walk. I want you to stomp like an elephant. Right? Because an elephant, whether it walks lightly or it stomps, it always leaves an impression. So the question is, what impression are you going to leave behind for those who come behind you? See, you have the power in your hands, in your mind, and in your actions to change the world. So I need your participation. So if I say stomp like an elephant, I need everybody to stomp. Can y'all do that with me? All right. Stomp like an elephant. Oh, y'all can do it. We can't be popcorn up in here now. We got to be in rhythm, right? This is an African day we're thinking about, so we got to be in rhythm. If you can't stomp, then you can clap, or you can bang on your leg, whatever it is. Stomp like an elephant. There you go. One time. Stomp like an elephant. There you go. All right, I like that better. So if you want to realize that you have the power to change the world, that you do the things necessary to change the world by recognizing that you have to take the steps to do so. So we're going to all work together, and we're going to stop like an elephant. Oh, man, y'all are off. Come on now. You're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to think differently. You're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to do differently. We're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to work with our neighbors differently. We're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to reach out and grab somebody and make sure that we touch them with the knowledge that we have, with the insights that we have. We're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to give somebody the information that we have. We're going to give them something that we have so that we share what we have with the world. We're going to stop like an elephant, and we're going to stop like an elephant, stop like an elephant, and change the world. That's what you're going to do. See, King said, you die when you refuse to stand up for, you die when you refuse to stand up for what's right. You die when you refuse to stand up for the truth. You die when you refuse to stand up for justice. That's from his sermon, but if not. So let you not refuse to stand up. Let you not die in your silence. Let you not die in your lack of participation in the voting process or an electoral process. Let you not die in your stand against totalitarianism. Let you not die in your stand against white supremacy. Let you not die in your stand against sexism and racism. Let you not die in any of those things. Let you stomp like an elephant. Let you stomp like an elephant. Stomp like an elephant and change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Can we give Dr. Khalfani another hand? And I'd like to leave you with my famous quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, and that is faith. Have the faith to take the step, even if you don't see the staircase.